Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is about witches and superstition. I am referring to Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galchen, which was published in 2021. Seriously, look how interesting this cover is. It's a woman who looks vaguely like a witch and a cow in a place surrounded by mysterious animals and whatnot. I think it's a pretty good looking cover. I also got this from my local bookstore, picked it out at random, and it seems to have been a good choice. For those who don't know, Rivka Galchen is a Jewish-Canadian writer who has been writing since the mid-2000s. She's written a couple of novels, several short stories, and a little bit of nonfiction. She's also a journalist. She works for The New Yorker, which I find to be very fascinating. And it appears that this book came about because she was doing some nonfiction work, researching Johannes Kepler. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's important, when she stumbled across the story of Johannes's mother being accused of being a witch and what came about as a result. And all of that was turned into this story here. Rivka's also won a number of awards for her work. Don't know too much else about her, but I really enjoyed this, so I look forward to checking out some of her other work, maybe some of her short stories in the near future. But without further ado, let's talk about Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. I'm going to recommend this, so I'm not going to spoil it in the summary section, but there might be some spoilers in the analysis section, so be aware of that. Go seek out this book. I am going to recommend it, of course, so definitely seek it out. But yeah, we'll do a summary, then an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch focuses on Katharina Kepler. She refers to herself as Katchen, which I don't quite know what that means. I think it's a personal kind of greeting that happened in the 1600s. But Katharina lives in the 1600s. She's a widow. She's in Germany, or what would later become known as Germany. She's also the mother of Johannes Kepler, the famed astronomer and astrologer. And that's kind of held against her as well, because some people view Johannes as a Kepler Johannes as a heretic for what he's saying and how it defies what the church has believed for so long. So it's a bit of a historical fiction taking place with real people, told through the use of her neighbor's help, because it's written in the epistolary style, but told from the perspective of her neighbor, Simon, who is writing on her behalf. As they become acquainted and become friends, although there are some barriers to this friendship that I'll note later. At the beginning of the story, Katharina is accused of witchcraft by her neighbor and former friend Ursula Reinbold. The person who's facilitating all of this, the ducal governor Einhorn, is just like, apologize for, poisoning her, or cursing her. Everything will go back to normal and we won't pursue anything further. And Katharina's like, this isn't a formal accusation. This is more like slander. I'm going to report you to the higher ups. And she does that, but that also gets her into trouble, because now Einhorn has to go through with this accusation of witchcraft. And so he goes about investigating her in the community and trying to figure out or trying to place the blame somewhere on her for the things that are going wrong in the community. Simon is helping, but Katharina is having some struggles with trying to prove her own innocence, because she's somewhat of a bitter woman because she's a widow, but she's also a bit jaded for what she's seen in the world, and it's viewed as unchristian-like, uncatholic-like in the eyes of her neighbors. She does try to apologize to Einhorn for accusing him of slander and whatnot, but But she tries to give him a gift, but he is just like, no. And she later realizes that that could have been seen as bribery, and he's going to use that against her to further this accusation of witchcraft. Throughout the story, we also see some testimony from her neighbors, some who say she's not a witch, others who say they don't really know for sure, but a lot of suspicious things have happened around Katharina. Others who point to her son, Johannes, and say he's a very strange person. Surely his mother had something to do with this. And other people who are just saying the meanest things and appear to be influenced by Ursula Reinbold, who wants some of her land and money that she feels she'll get if Katharina is properly accused of witchcraft. Johannes comes to her defense, as he did in actual history, and asserts that all of these people are lying and making up tales in order to adhere to superstition or to just get some money out of the entire thing for personal gain. Unfortunately, Katharina is still taken to jail while she is on trial and has a miserable time in jail. And from there, the rest of the story takes place. I encourage you to go read this if you want to learn exactly what happens. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, which is just a delightful title. If we're talking about the title, you know, it shows up in some of the themes in the story. Like, everyone knows your mother is a witch. Like, it's already assumed that she's a witch. There will be no fair trial. I think that has something to do with the misogyny and feminism kind of leanings that Rivka has that she touches upon later in the story. But I'll get to that in a few moments. One of the main themes of the story, though, the main idea, is that of superstition and religion. In order to fully, explain this and provide a background for it, we first have to understand how we got to this point in European history. Why are people accusing each other of being witches? How did it happen? Given that, people weren't accusing each other of being witches 300 years before this or 200 years before this. And I think it all goes back to the printing press. Gutenberg, created the printing press in Europe, not the first one. There were other ones before that. But he created the printing press, which allowed people to have more access to books, and that increased the literacy rates. More literacy rates and more access to books gave people more access to the Bible. Which allowed people to see what the Word of God and Jesus was all about. But in doing so, people also split off from the main Catholic Church. You have the Lutherans, the Protestants, the Calvinists, a whole bunch of different sects forming of the Christian religion at the time, because everyone has their own understanding of what the words of Jesus and God really mean. And as a result of this, you have a bunch of people clashing with one another, deciding, I'm not going to tolerate your behavior anymore. I'm going to America and going to lead my own country there with my own religion. But with more people believing in God, you also have more people who are aware of the work of the devil, at least according to the Bible. They're more fearful of the devil. They're becoming more superstitious, even though that kind of defies the word of God. But that's for other people to decide whether or not that actually means that they're going against God's word there. But the people are fearful of the devil, and the science isn't quite helping them understand where they are in the world yet. All they know is the stars. Some medicine is being learned about, but a lot of people don't really understand what's going on in terms of biology and chemistry and stuff like that. That you still have another 200 or so years to go in the 1600s at this point. So people are seeing omens and curses where there really are none. But for them, those omens and curses are there. Like, if you get sick and you remember, oh, my neighbor was there prior to me getting sick, surely they have something to do with this. Like, my crops are dying, my animals are dying. Somebody has to be to blame for this, because God would not do this to me. It has to be the work of the devil, and somebody has to be in league with the devil in my community. So Really, Galchen is pointing at all of this and showing the connections there of how, the Bible and all of that would eventually lead to more people having access to all of this, but also more people having access to, superstition and whatnot. Galchen specifically talks about Martin Luther several times in this story, noting that his breaking away from the church was somewhat of a positive for the people in this community, but also Martin Luther wasn't as all pure as some people would have you believe. And so in this time of superstition and religion, all hard times are going to be met with greater suspicion than it normally was. It's not simply your plants dying or your crops dying or things just taking a turn for the worse. You have to have an outlet for that. There's war, there's plague, there's a lot going on. And again, someone has to be to blame. And unfortunately, in this story, Katharina is the one to blame, unfortunately. Galchen is saying, Katharina is there. Like, she's the perfect scapegoat because she's a widow. Like, if you blame her, you get her money or something like that. And things are going to be less stressful for you. But at the same time, Katharina is a good scapegoat because her son, Johannes, is saying heretical things against the church. He's like, space exists and there's other planets and we aren't alone in the universe, so therefore we aren't as special as some people believe in God's eyes. And so there might be something greater out there. And the church is like, absolutely not. This person deserves to be punished. Unfortunately, they can't punish Johannes because he is in the imperial, the imperial mathematician, and the emperor likes him, the emperor of Germany. Who do you blame? Well, you target one of his family members, his mother, who happens to be, again, the perfect scapegoat in this situation. So see how all that superstition and religion and the specific moment of time can lead to something as destructive as the witch trials, not only in Europe, but also in America. Galchen also seems to be talking about greed here. Like, a lot of these accusations about Katharina are based on a desire for Katharina's wealth. As I mentioned before, the people in the story have fallen on hard times due to the 30 Years' War and plague and things not really working out as they had in the past. Katharina is doing pretty well, but even she's going to fall on hard times eventually. But all people see is that she has money and land, and that's something to be exploited, to be used against her, and to be pointed at as like, oh, she cheated in order to get all this. She used her witchcraft to obtain all of this. And that's really something that happened in the witchcraft trials of the 1600s, is that a lot of people were trying to settle scores. That especially happened in Salem, as a lot of people who weren't really friends and who had conflicts with one another were trying to settle those issues by accusing each other of being witches. And then someone steps in and is like, why are you doing this? Like, this is destructive. Please stop it, or you're all getting excommunicated. And I don't think that quite stopped it. But that was just the case in Salem. This is Germany, but the sentiments still remain that a lot of the accusations of witchcraft stem from greed, from very greedy people who don't really care who they hurt. Galchen is also talking about misogyny in this story. Katharina is a woman of power and prestige in a male-dominated society, in a male-dominated period of time in 1600s Germany. Women, they were allowed to inherit land, but it wasn't really, welcomed when they had that power and prestige. And during this time, women were mostly targeted for witchcraft. There might have been some men who were accused of sorcery or whatnot, but it was mostly women who were accused of witchcraft and punished and put to death for it. And that largely had to do with the fact that these women were outsiders in their society, like Katharina, who was a widow and who was kind of hard to get along with, but she helped her society because she was an herbalist. She made medicines and whatnot to help people, but she still worked on the fringes of society, so she was seen as an outcast of some sort, an outsider. And if you have those kinds of people in your society, you're going to accuse them of of being the source of your problem whenever possible. What's also interesting is that Katharina specifically mentions a Jewish man in this story who is also seen as an outsider. And if you're familiar at all with your history, especially in Europe, the Jewish people were not treated well throughout European history. Anytime something went wrong, Jews were a scapegoat, and they were beaten or exiled or something like that in the many towns in which they showed up. So kind of drawing a comparison between the misogyny as well as the anti-Semitism that existed in Europe. And just anybody who was an outsider, like a spinster of some sort, oh, you're not a traditional woman, therefore you are wrong, and it's fine to accuse you of witchcraft. And I think those in power knew that it was wrong, but again, in order to maintain their power and appear like they were doing the right thing, they had to go along with this sort of thing. And what's worse is they accuse Katharina of witchcraft in this sort of worst way possible, because they accuse her of driving away her dead husband. Like, he didn't die, he just escaped because Katharina was overbearing and she was in league with the devil, and therefore she was a bad wife. Again, bad wife. Like, she wasn't doing her duties properly as a woman. And even though she's compassionate, that's still seen as somewhat of a fault. Women are often seen as compassionate, and this is used against them, unfortunately. Unfortunately, even though Katharina still wins in this story, even though she is able to break free of the witchcraft charges and not be put to death, she still loses in the story. She loses her land. She loses her family to plague. She loses her money. Everything is kind of taken away from her. And there's an interesting quote that gets at the feeling that she's going through at the end of the story. As the miles passed, I began to wonder if maybe it was simply that Katharina couldn't be bothered to convict me, that she was too morally exhausted. If I was tired, then she must have been all the more tired. She didn't seem like the same woman I had known before. Her apparent peace could as well be a sign of terrible defeat as a sign of the grace of God. And that's Simon talking about how he ran into Katharina later in life. And rather than yell at him for not really being there at the very end, because he was a trusted friend, like, she's just like, oh, I don't blame you for deciding to leave. And Simon's like, well, that could be a sign that she's forgiven, but it could also be, she's tired. Like, she's had everything taken away from her. This is a defeated woman at the end of the story. This is the end result of all of that misogyny and terror that she faced in her life. Not only during the witchcraft trials, but even before, because she did not have an easy life. And even though she wins, again, she still unfortunately loses, which makes this a bit of a downer ending, but probably very reflective of the women who faced and lived through witchcraft trials. Another thing I want to note is how similar this feels to Augustus by John Williams. Augustus was a story, another historical fiction narrative told about the life of Augustus Caesar, from his sort of crowning moment as the new ruler of Rome to sort of his life and his death and the civil wars that he fought, kind of presented in a diary or epistolary style. So similar to this story. However, everyone feels like statues in those stories, not very real or vibrant characters. But in Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, like Katharina, Johannes, Simon, her neighbors, they all feel like real and actual people who are out there. I do like how Rivka was able to make these real people feel so alive and give them personality in this story. So although the Augustus is kind of similar and it has a lot of powerful themes, I do think that Rivka does a better job in terms of bringing life to these fictional characters, or these real characters that she's decided to fictionalize. My one issue with this story is that I do think that Rivka could elaborate on the setting a little bit more. Like, she tells us this takes place in 1600s Germany, but I don't feel like I got a feel for the actual setting in which this takes place. It just seems like a play of some sort with like a backdrop, ill-defined kind of setting, but there, and you kind of understand where it's coming from, but it really only makes sense if you have the historical learnings that, like I do, that you you would need in order to understand this story. I guess you could say Rivka probably senses that, or she believes that everyone has the same knowledge she has, which they definitely don't. So a little bit more work with developing the setting and elaborating on it could have made this story a little bit more powerful, in my opinion. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galchen. A pretty good story, one that I'm definitely going to recommend to you out there. I really loved Katharina's character and the setting, and the sort of exploration of like superstition and misogyny and in the witchcraft trials. So a really, really good book. I also read this on an airplane, and the biggest compliment I can give this is it's a great airplane read. Makes the time just fly by. You're really invested in it, and if you're flying, like in the time it takes to get to places, this is going to make things a lot easier for you. But it'll also be a good book if you just sit down and read it as well. It's pretty fun to read, so I definitely recommend it to you out there. If you have any thoughts on it, if you want to say something about my review, do so in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch or Rivka Galchen if they don't already know. Otherwise, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books or movies or whatnot. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and witchcraft travels. Farewell.